Hello, everybody, and welcome to Virtual Bourbon. My name is Steve Akley. We have a fun event tonight because we have Wes Hardin with us. That means we're going to be tasting a Dusty tonight, and he has a real winner here. He's got a Kentucky Tavern from 1968, also the year of me, Colonel Steve. That was the year I was born, so that's my vintage as well. So I'm looking forward to trying this one. I didn't try it the first time through, at least not that I know of. I had grandparents that were into putting a little booze on when you're teething, so maybe I did. I might have actually tried this. I'll see if I remember it as we get into it. But fun stuff, and yes, as always, these are good. Our normal format, we'll go through. Wes will lead a tasting. He'll also provide all kinds of background and history. He'll kind of intertwine those things, kind of take some breaks from the tasting to do the history. Of course, you have your blind samples in front of you. And then at the end, just for fun, like we always do, we will guess to see if we can tell what is the Dusty. So with that, I'll turn it over to our host for tonight, Mr. Wes Hardin. Hey, Wes.
Hey, guys. How's it going?
Good.
All right, so let's jump into this. I think everybody here is a veteran, but I don't think we have anybody new. Joe just dropped off. Hopefully he gets back on. So we won't go through the format. I think Steve's already done that. Let's jump back into it and go ahead and get started on the history. Real quick, if you want to go ahead and pour sample, you should have a sample 1 and a sample 2. The bottles are labeled with little black stickers with a little silver Sharpie 1 and 2. Go ahead and pour those if you want. And we can have those poured, and we'll get into a little bit of the history. So one of the samples tonight, like Steve said, is a 1968 Kentucky Tavern. It actually came out of the Captain's Ship bottle. I think on one of our previous Dusty events, I showed everyone that bottle. It's the what I call the birthday bourbon on steroids. So it's, if you can imagine the shape of a birthday bourbon, close to twice the diameter. Like, it's super wide and short.
I'm going to grab one. I've got one right here.
Yeah, I've got mine, but it's on the other side of the room.
Okay, I can grab mine. Mine's right up there. But as we do that, I wanted to tell Kent Mace, as I poured mine, number 2 is the darker. So you said you might have confused your samples. Number 2 is the dark one now that I poured mine. So let me grab this thing real quick. Hold on, guys.
Yeah. So while Steve's doing that, I'll go ahead. And so we're going to be tasting that for sure. And then, like we always do, we try to taste history versus what's being made today. It's not always a direct translation, but at least brand-wise, it's a translation. And we are going to taste also a current off-the-shelf Kentucky Tavern made by a different distillery. We'll get into the history of that.
So this is what it comes like. It would come in a box, full quart. And then you open this up, and there is the beautiful
there decanter.
It is. Again, it's very wide at the bottom. It's meant to be on the ship and not to tilt over. So
yeah, it looks like a donut and a genie bottle married each other, and there it is.
Yeah.
There actually were multiple variations of that. So that is like the brown label, for lack of better terms, in the clear glass. The one that we're tasting tonight, the bottle that I had, was the clear glass version, but it's a blue label. And then they actually have a I don't know what the actual metal is, but on the outside, it looks like it's like a gold or a bronze. They actually have, they had a version of that was not clear at all. It was actually like the 80 proof, or was in like a aluminum bottle or whatever the case may be. So they actually had different variations of that Captain's Ship.
This one is from 1956.
Yeah, there you go. So they kind of ran those off and on as like a special release. In 50s, 60s, and 70s, I believe it was. And it may be, I'd have to do the research. It may be that the different bottle iterations were for the different decades or something like that. But let's jump into it. I'll go through a little bit of the history, then we'll sample number 1, and then we'll get back into it. I've actually got quite a long history and bit of information here, so I'll try to break it up into big chunks and make sure no one falls asleep. All right, so again, we're talking Kentucky Tavern. All the history is we start from the Dusty all the way to current. So Kentucky Tavern, the Dusty we have is from Glenmore Distillery. So that distillery, in the site still exists. It's now owned by Sazerac. They still actually use that location for some bottling and some storage and some other activities there today. But originally, it was the Glenmore Distillery. The brand started in the early 1800s, and it was the bourbon was produced by R. Monarch Monarch Distillery in Owensboro. In 1898, the brand was purchased by James Thompson, and a lot of the history is going to be the Thompson family here. And basically, Monarch went into bankruptcy. James Thompson purchased in 1898, and then they changed the name to Glenmore Distilling Company. At the time, they actually had locations in Owensboro and Louisville. They had a plant out in Shively area of Louisville as well. And we'll get into a little bit of that later, what that plant was. We've actually talked about that facility in one of our other Dusty events before, so it'll kind of tie all that together. James Thompson, quick history on him. He was born in Ireland in 1855, came to America in 71. He worked for two of his uncles in Bowling Green, which actually has zero to little distilling history, which is kind of strange, but it's very close to Owensboro geographically. It's probably closer than Louisville is for sure, and was closer than a lot of the bourbon industry. And basically the way it worked is he worked there for 2 years to pay off the debt to his uncles because they funded his trip from Ireland to the US. So they funded the boat ride, they funded any kind of expenses, they funded his immigration to the US. And to repay that, he actually worked for those guys for 2 years to pay off that debt, which was probably a common thing back in the 1800s. We always talk about these Dusty's events, how all these different figures intermingle, and there's all these families of bourbon that marry into other families of bourbon. He was actually a cousin to George Garvin Brown. Yes, the same George Garvin Brown from Brown-Forman lore. So that's kind of an interesting piece of history that he was an actual cousin to George Garvin Brown. He actually worked for George Garvin at Old Forester, and he was a salesman. So he sold Old Forester.
Oh. Wes is locked up. Mr. Mill, I believe you take it
after
over.
He worked his 2 years with his uncle.
Here he is.
Started selling bourbon for Old Forester, Brown-Forman. And he was there for about 8 years. So he was there for about 8 years as a partner in Brown-Forman. In 1889, his younger brother, Francis P.
Wes?
Sorry about that. I'm back.
Okay.
Sorry about that. I don't know what happened there.
Froze up a couple times there. So.
Okay. All right. Let's keep going. Then we'll see what happens. So in 1889, his younger brother, Francis P., came to America and joined him. And when he joined him, they formed the James Thompson and Brothers Company. So he kind of broke away from Brown-Forman and joined and started the James Thompson and Brothers Company. Like a lot of people today and a lot of people in bourbon history, it takes a lot of money to go start up or purchase a distillery. So they got their start as rectifiers. They purchased different whiskeys from all over the local area and started making their own blend. And their original bourbon they came out with, or their blended whiskey, was called Old Thompson. So that was the initial brand that they came out with when they ventured off on their own, was Old Thompson. I think right now, let's take a second. Let's go ahead and jump into sample number 1 if you guys have poured that yet. And let's get some nosing, tasting opinions. For anybody this is the first Dusty event, any opinions you have on which is which and so forth, let's hold those to the very end. When we go through these samples, what we're really doing is just giving your opinion on taste, mouthfeel, nose, flavor, whatever. But if you can, try to save your opinions of which is the Dusty and which is the current edition of the whiskey until the very end. We do a voting and then keep a tally at the end.
I don't know if I've ever even tried Kentucky Tavern. I've been drinking bourbon for like 40 years.
Yeah, I think that's going to be a common theme, actually.
I mean, I've seen it. I don't know if I've ever even tried. I was born in '68, so this should be interesting.
Hey, me too.
Oh, look at that.
How about that?
2 grizzled veterans of whiskey. Right?
Joe's held up better though. Joe's held up better. I admit it.
Joe lives in Florida, so he's got that extra.
It's true.
Gives him extra 10 years. Yeah, it gives him 10 years on everybody else.
I mean, it's got a fairly light nose, but it's not unpleasant. It's fruity, I think.
Yeah, I agree. I'm getting like both bananas and some citrus in there too. So definitely
Yep.
fruity for me.
I definitely 100% get the banana.
Mhm.
I get a little bit of like grain, like a corn husk, kind of a grainy note to it.
Anybody getting any peanut brittle on this one?
No, I'm not.
No,
Did you eat peanut brittle today, Tim?
no, I did not. It's the first thing that came to mind when I started nosing it.
Well, now that you said that, I smell a little peanut dust.
Okay.
It's peanut. That's what maybe what it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it's possible that corn husk that I thought I had, it could be peanut dust.
Get a little bit of grandma's Jello mold, like when you're making Jello, that when you put the Jello in that hot water and you get that fruity kind of that permeates the kitchen.
Yeah, younger.
That may be a first.
Yeah, put that on the wheel. Add
But that goes on the wheel.
That goes on the wheel.
It's now the giant wheel.
Yeah,
Hey, it's better than grandma's bathtub or
yeah,
bath.
who needs marzipan when you have grandma's Jello mold?
All right, let's taste this thing. I mean, it's fruity, peachy kind of, maybe.
Yeah, pretty light.
Yeah, light,
Real thin.
Real
thin,
thin. Yeah, light,
real thin, light.
Yeah. Not
No real, finish. Very light
Yeah.
on the finish. Yeah.
yeah, I would say if I had to rate the finish from 1 to 10, I'm probably at about a 1 or 2.
Right. Yeah, I would say so too.
But I will say that it's not like it doesn't have a youthful harshness or anything to it.
No,
Exactly.
it's not
It's-
unpleasant.
No,
The-
it's not actually.
The straw color made me think it would be really grainy,
Right.
glassy, but it's not.
No, it's
Yeah.
not.
Been years, man, but I think that's tastes.
I don't feel like you could put this one in a cocktail. It would disappear. I mean, there's
Yeah,
no-
probably so.
It
there's
reminds me
nothing-
of Basil Hayden kind
Shine
of.
here.
I haven't
Yeah.
drank Basil Hayden in 15, 20 years.
Yeah,
but
that's probably a good.
kind of reminds me of that.
Yeah, a little bit of that. Maybe. Yeah, it kind of reminds me of. Like not near spicy, but a little bit of Four Roses Yellow Label to a degree. Although I think the Four Roses would hold up because of the spice.
Yeah. I don't know, for $13 for a handlebar, it's not bad.
Copy that. All right. Anyone else have any comments about the taste or nose on this guy before I move on?
No.
All right, let's get going then. So he and his brother started off as rectifiers. In 1891, his brother Francis actually died, so it kind of left James back to running the company alone. And this is, again, just another one of these pieces of information that kind of names are real familiar. He married, this is a person's name, Atlanta, as in the city. He married Atlanta Barton, Barton, so we all know, Barton Distillery, Barton Brands. In 1894, they started having a family. In 1898, he actually purchased the old Monarch Distillery, which we kind of said in the opening, and then he renamed it to Glenmore. So in 1898, the Monarch Distillery was renamed to Glenmore. It had that name for a year, all the way into I think I've got it down here, but into like the 80s, 90s time frame. So in 1898, well before Prohibition, well before the turn of the century, that Owensboro Monarch Distillery was Glenmore. At that time, that's when they started producing Kentucky Tavern. And from there, that brand of that distillery grew tremendously. He actually placed his brother-in-law, Harry S. Barton, in charge of the distillery. And evidently, Harry Barton and the Barton family at the time were known to be very good distillers of whiskey. He put him in charge of the operations portion of the distillery. So I don't know. It doesn't say. I couldn't find out if he was ever considered a master distiller or not. I don't know if they even had that back then.
Right.
But for all intents and purposes, he's the guy running the show. He's the head distiller. He's making the whiskey and making product go out the door. In 1902, Thompson actually trademarked the Kentucky Tavern brand. So that brand has been trademarked since 1902, which is a little bit of information I had no idea about. It was one of the largest distilleries, both size and production-wise, in Kentucky. And even back then, they were doing 720 barrels a day. So you think about some of the big distilleries today and the technology they have, the methods that they have today with moving barrels around and moving production and the whole 9 yards. For the late 1800s and early 1900s, for a distillery to do 720 barrels a day is actually pretty phenomenal. I mean, a lot of this dusty these events we go through and pull the history. We'll have a distillery that, you know, they expanded. They were doing 350 barrels a day, or 250, or 300, or whatever. 720 is a huge amount back then.
Yeah. I wonder where that would place them today in Kentucky in production. I mean, they'd be pretty high up there. I mean, obviously the next level after the heritage brands, but you know, in terms of the next ones, you know, Wilderness Trail and New Riff and
I would say that it puts them probably in this weird category in between those two groups. So, you know, obviously Heaven Hill, Bernheim,
Beam,
Jim Beam, even Old Forester. I don't know if they're at 750. I don't know if they're at 750 a day. They might be. I don't know. I don't know what Makers is pretty big, but they're probably not a whole lot more than that. I think
Buffalo Trace does about 1 bottle a day.
they only put out 1 bottle a day.
Oh, yeah. That's what they sell. 1 bottle.
It takes them a month to do a barrel.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, Buffalo Trace is probably right there with Heaven Hill as the 1-2 top producers, but I think they're even maxed at like 1,500 barrels a day.
Yeah. What do you think Turkey's at?
I'd say Turkey's probably in that 1,000 range.
Yeah, that's what I would
be
think
my
too.
guess. So, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, Turkey's everywhere. It's a huge brand. It's a heritage brand. I would say outside of those 4 or 5 top heritage brands, this distillery in the late 1800s would outproduce anybody else out there today.
Yeah.
Outside of the top ones. Jack Daniels, obviously, they're not going to outproduce them.
No.
But any of the other mid-major and mid-level players, they're absolutely going to crush with technology that's hundreds of years old. So it's kind of interesting. 720 barrels a day is a large number. It's the highest I've seen since we started doing these. Like a lot of companies, Prohibition, Thompson actually applied and acquired a license to sell and produce medicinal whiskey. So he was one of the very few that actually went to get the license and received it. So that helped him keep the operation open. The distillery stayed open. The company stayed open. They went and bought whiskey from other locations, other companies, and basically sold it as medicinal whiskey through Prohibition. In 1924, he passed away, and a guy named Joseph Englehart became president of the distillery. James's son, Frank, at the time was involved, but not heavily. He had a bunch of other businesses, and he was really involved just enough to kind of keep the family name as owning the business. But ultimately, this Englehart guy was the president of the company and ran the business. In 27, Englehart merged James Thompson and Brothers with Glenmore Distillery because they, from a business standpoint, even when they purchased the distillery and changed it to Glenmore, they kept the Thompson and Brothers company separate from the distillery. In 27, he merged them together into Glenmore Distillery's company. So it's just all business wordplay. What's interesting about that is it's one of those things where it happens all the time in all industries nowadays, but they were still doing it back in those days. It's not anything that's actually really new. This is kind of proof of that. Its paperwork changed, like I said, and they kept it separate. After repeal, Glenmore ramped production back up. And in 1934, they created what was probably one of the first special holiday packages. So we've all seen online. I've had some, I've shown them. 50s, 60s, 70s, 50s and 60s, they did it as more of just advertising and to kind of have a special packaging. 70s and 80s, the companies would do these tricks with decanters and gift packages simply because they couldn't move any products. So they had to dress it up. But they have got to be one of the first ones. 1934, they created what I think is one of the first special holiday packages. I don't know of any that I've heard of before the 50s, really.
Oh, no.
And it was a snowman made out of a cardboard box. Yeah, I mean, even
That's
those,
the old phone. This is from the 50s. So
This
this
is from
is
the
when Old
50s.
Forester was doing it.
exactly. So I mean, I'm sure there's some examples somewhere that'll come up, but I haven't heard of them. And this particular one was, they made a snowman out of like a cardboard. It was made out of cardboard, not too dissimilar from some of the things that they've done in the past. And they basically took the snowman cardboard piece, decorated it like a snowman, put it over a quart of Kentucky Tavern, and that was a holiday gift box. Yeah, super popular. And again, in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, almost every brand were doing, take the decanters out of it, just the holiday gift boxes were super popular from the 50s till probably the 70s and into the 80s. Beam was doing it. Old Taylor was doing it. National Distillers, all of their brands, Old Taylor, Old Grandad, Old Crow, everyone at Old Forester was doing it. They not only had the decanters, they had gift boxes for theirs. Wild Turkey had gift boxes. Back then it wasn't Wild Turkey, it was JTS Brown, but pretty much everybody was doing this. But I tend to think that Kentucky Tavern and Glenmore were one of the first ones to do it, which is pretty interesting. In 1938, this seems to be a similar story for all these old distilleries. A major fire destroyed a large quantity of the aged whiskey, but unlike like the Heaven Hill fire and some others, the distillery was spared. So the distillery did not burn down. It looks like it only hit some of the warehouses. And so they continued to produce and grow the Kentucky Tavern brand. In 44, this is where some of that history comes back to previous. In 44, they purchased the Yellowstone Distillery in Shively, Kentucky, which is here in Louisville. And then that became an absolute crazy brand. And I did not know this, after World War II, Glenmore actually purchased a cooperage. And then they also, to expand the business, they actually purchased an import business, and they were importing and selling Scotch and European spirits as well as kind of like a subsidiary side hustle business after World War II. So after World War II, they had two of the most popular, if not the most popular brands. I know because everyone thinks Jim Beam's been the top seller from the beginning of time. And, you had the George T. Stagg distillery back then. You had all the Shinley distilleries. Maker's Mark was nothing. It wasn't even around back then. Kentucky Tavern, Yellowstone were two of the highest selling, largest produced, most popular brands from really right before Prohibition all the way up until the bourbon dropout of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It's a common theme we come across every time we get into these two brands and these activities here. So it's pretty interesting. From the late 40s and through the early 60s, Glenmore and Yellowstone continue to produce these extremely popular brands. And Kentucky Tavern was one of the most popular kind of nationwide brands, and Yellowstone was the top selling brand in Kentucky and became super popular mass market. So the Glenmore company was really a powerhouse all the way up until 60s and into the 70s. Let's take a second, mainly because I need a drink, but let's take a second. Let's jump into sample number 2.
Okay. That's good on the nose.
That's an interesting nose.
Kind of molasses and pepper.
Yeah. Man, I'm getting something really distinct. I can't figure out what it is.
Anybody get anything else on the nose?
I'm getting like a cherry cobbler. Like I'm
Cherry
getting,
cobbler.
I'm
Got
getting
it.
like the cherry, and I'm getting like the spices from like a baked good. Cherry
Mhm.
cobbler is the
Yep.
first thing. Could be a cherry pie, could be a cherry little fried cherry pie type of thing, but it's definitely baking spices, sugary, buttery dough, and a stone fruit. Maybe it's peach, but to me it comes off as cherry.
No, I think you hit it. I get that cherry cobbler as well. And there's a wood note there too as well. It's really deep in there. You got to go after it. But it's got some really, really deep wood notes as well.
Sweet cream to me. It's got some sweet cream in it.
Yeah, it's a super sweet.
I agree with you,
nose.
Kent. Yeah. So it's like that, that cherry pie I was talking about has a little scoop of ice cream with it or something.
Little dab of
Yeah.
Cool Whip or ice
And
cream or
A la
it's
mode.
not the cream whip stuff.
Right.
It's real
The
stuff.
real stuff.
Mike. Does this have a nose to you like grandma's rolling pin or something, or any other utensils?
Grandma's really
More like granddad's garage.
There you go, granddad's garage. I like it.
Got a little
Barn dirt.
got a little musty going on.
Yeah, this one is a really rich amber red color to it.
Mm-hmm.
And the legs on this thing are like, it is slow. Like if you guys
Yeah.
just take your glass and tilt and then come back to straight
Look at
and
that,
watch the
yeah.
legs. I mean, it's like somebody just kind of strolling down the street real slowly.
You're gonna be there a minute.
Oh, man. You know, I get a little bit of a hint of, and maybe it's that wood, or that earthiness, but I go back on the nose and I got a little bit of like a leather, like that earthy wood leather kind of on the nose
Mhm.
as well.
You hit that sweet cream right, Kent. It's the one where grandma made you, you had to whisk it yourself by hand at
Oh, yeah.
Thanksgiving dinner before dessert comes out. You had to work for it in order to get it. It didn't come out of a can.
I smell a crawl space.
A crawl space.
Yep.
That's musty.
Yeah, I got
Must
a little.
dirt,
Yeah, I'm getting a little
dirt,
clove.
little must.
I say clove.
I got a little clove on the palate. I didn't smell it, but tasting it, I get a little clove.
Yeah, to me, taste, when I taste it, it's a little more spicy than the nose.
Mm.
And it's
Yeah.
definitely more earthy and less fruity than the nose to me.
Mhm.
But you was talking about the crawl space smell. That's a perfect place to store your bourbon, isn't it?
Crawl space
Yeah, maybe.
next to the bodies.
It's to hold down the smell of the body. So yeah, this smells like
It's-
fresh. It smells like
It's the
fresh
angel
cadaver.
share.
Yeah.
Cadaver.
I get fresh cadaver on this one.
Little embalming fluid.
Little embalming, little formaldehyde.
We are starting to talk about the 30s now, aren't we?
Mhm.
I'm not getting any formaldehyde, and I smell that every day.
Yeah, in the 30s, you wouldn't find the body, so that's not possible. When they got rid of you back then, they got rid of you.
We're gonna get into George Remus territory here real quick.
Yeah. Remus.
We
That's,
turn the bodies into bourbon.
That there's this whole online thing going on like Twitter for the most part, where these goody two shoe people keep asking the question, should MGP or now Let's Go really be honoring a man who killed his wife and was a lifetime criminal by giving him his own bourbon? I'm so sick of that freaking argument. I can't stand it. The whole George Remus thing.
I didn't know his wife. Maybe she deserved it. I don't know.
If you read the book or read the
Maybe she
history,
likes it.
she very much deserved it.
Maybe she likes that. Maybe she
Yeah, it's
wanted
just
to do
it's
it.
just
Into that kind of thing.
the whole conversation drives me insane. Like,
Yeah, definitely one of the truly interesting characters of all time. I mean, that story, why that's never been a movie, I don't know. I mean,
He's always been like a piece of like a show or a
yeah,
like,
yeah.
he was on
He's a
Boardwalk
character on it,
Empire.
yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
Instead of,
Yeah.
it's insane.
Yeah, he needs his own 10.
Yeah, the whole thing of
ABV
being
series.
a pharmacist and then, selling medicinal and then ripping himself off, figuring out how to rip yourself off and collect on insurance and on selling it. And yeah, I mean.
All right,
Totally.
anybody else have any tasting notes before we move on here?
Yeah, I like this one.
All right,
like
you
it.
like, there you go. It's official.
By the way, one connection, my a guy I used to know when I worked at my old job, his dad knew George Remus because he lived in the neighborhood
wow.
in Cincinnati where he was, and he said it was a cool place to be because Remus would because he had a pool, and that was not common to have a pool in a residence in those days. And every once in a while, he would let all the kids in the neighborhood come over and play in the pool. So
Nice.
they thought in the neighborhood, they thought George Remus was great. So, yeah. And this was after his criminal career. This was towards the end of his life because, interesting.
All right, let's jump back into it. So we left off, we're basically talking about how popular the brands were after World War II, really after Prohibition, but after World War II, 40s, 50s, 60s. During this same time frame, 40s through 60s, outside of the holiday gift boxes and so forth, they actually released a large creative collection of decanters. Some of the most famous ones are obviously the Captain's Decanter, which is where the whiskey that we're sampling tonight came from. But there was also one they called the Pineapple. So it was a short, squat glass bottle decanter that came with what they did a lot of times back then. It came with it has a natural cork, and the cork will go bad, crumble over time. So it also would come with like a glass stopper that you could use the decanter over and over. They called it the Pineapple because it was short and squat, and it would look like a pineapple, and it had all the little indentations and make it look like a pineapple. So I've seen a couple of those out in some of the forums and so forth. But yeah, they're out there. They had a couple called the Holiday, which looked more like one of the tall, skinny, lamp-looking decanters, like very similar to one of the Old Forester from the 50s. And then they had a striped version of that called the Striped Holiday. So they had more than that. Those were kind of the most popular ones. So they were big into, even before they needed to, they were big into marketing, different packaging, putting the same whiskey in different packaging to attract a different set of consumers and so forth. So they were kind of at the forefront of a lot of that. They kept churning along. In 1965, Joseph Englehart retired, and Frank B. Thompson, who was a family member. Frank, we talked about him earlier, and who Buddy's brother became the new president of Glenmore Distillery. So James Buddy Thompson, who was Frank's son, it was also named after James Thompson. So this confused the hell out of me when I was doing the research, because with a lot of those historic bourbon and non-bourbon names, a lot of family names always stay the same, and the middle name would change. And so you have to really go by first name, middle initial, but it confused the hell out of me. But at the end of the day, it was Frank's brother. It was James' brother Frank, his son, who was named Buddy after his granddad, is what it really amounts to. He had other interests, but he kind of got sucked into the business. He got his law degree. He owned and ran the old Southern Life Insurance Company. And he really didn't get a lot into the business early on. In 70, though, Glenmore expanded again, and they purchased the old Mr. Boston Company. So we did an old Mr. Boston decanter very early on. I don't know, it was probably one of the first 3 or 4 we did, I would say. Yeah. Steve, Bill was there for it, I believe. And at the time, we didn't go through a ton of the Glenmore history because I knew I wanted to do something more Glenmore specific, but we did mention that the actual old Mr. Boston Company started off as a brewery distillery in Boston. Then it was sold off through the years. And for a while in the 70s and 80s, Glenmore was putting out decanters under the old Mr. Boston company name. So if you ever run across an old Mr. Boston decanter, most people that have those have no idea what they are. And they typically just think that they're just not very good. And you can get it, if you can find them, you can get them on the cheap. Just know if you see one, it is from the Glenmore Distillery back in the 70s and 80s, and it's going to be good stuff. So it's kind of a buying tip there, if you know what I mean. In 74, Frank was diagnosed with brain cancer, and it kind of forced Buddy to stop with his law practice and stop with the insurance, and he came into the company and took it over. So for 74 to 88, Buddy ran the company, got merged with it, found a love for bourbon, found a love for the company. They grew again, and this time they grew with the acquisition of Medley Distillery and their brands in Owensboro. So in 1988, which really is at the beginning, a little further than the beginning of the whiskey downturn, they purchased Medley Distillery, which has a whole separate history, and we're going to do a Medley based event in the future at some point. But they basically owned all of the two major distilleries in Owensboro. They were the king of Owensboro's. But in 91, we know into the 90s, bourbon tanked, vodka and clear spirits are there. Everyone's scrambling for their lives, and anybody that owns companies are basically getting rid of them left and right. Buddy decided to sell the company to United Distillers, but he actually stayed on for a while and kind of transitioned into it, and then he ultimately retired. What's interesting is when he sold the company, if you remember, they now own 3 distilleries. They own the Yellowstone Distillery in Louisville, and then the 2 distilleries in Owensboro. When he sold, he actually kept the Yellowstone Mellow Mash trademark, and he kept the whiskey in the warehouse for that brand. So when we did the Yellowstone event with Steve Beam, I don't know if he had a bottle with him, but he definitely talked about that Black Label Dusty that had Mellow Mash. If you remember that, Steve.
Yep.
So what's interesting is that is the exact brand and bottle that Buddy Thompson kept. He kept the trademark and he kept the whiskey in the warehouse because that was his, of all the whiskey they produced from the company, both that Yellowstone Medley and in Glenmore, that was his personal favorite. He loved the whiskey coming, the Yellowstone Mellow Mash whiskey coming out of the Louisville operation. His original idea keeping that was he was going to spin off and become a rectifier and use that aged whiskey, that Mellow Mash whiskey, and kind of follow the Van Winkle game plan of what they did after they left Stitzel. They left Stitzel, went and bought the old Hoffman distillery. They bought a bunch of stock from Stitzel, and they went and sold it as obviously the Pappy Van Winkle, but they sold it as Old Commonwealth and all these other oddball brands in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. So that was his initial plan. Didn't really find out why it didn't come to pass, but it didn't. So what happened was all that whiskey, they tanked all that whiskey. Probably, man, I think it was 3 or 4 years ago. Remember that really big release they had down at the Fraser History Museum, and people camped out for a week to get, like, it was a ridiculously small amount of bottles, and it was the final reserve. It came in the decanter with the big case and all that jazz.
Had a little sidecar so you could pop it open, a 200
That's
milliliter.
it.
Yeah.
That whiskey is this whiskey that he kept after the sellout to United Distillers. He kept for his own personal use. And once he decided, I'm sure the decision was, the bourbon industry's tanked. I can't sell it. No one's selling bourbon. It's sitting on the shelf. So what he did is he tanked it in aluminum tanks. And then later, when the bourbon boom hit and all the premiums started becoming popular in 2012, 13, 14, he decided, all right, now we can let loose this whiskey. We can make some money off of it. And so if you ever wanted to know where that whiskey came from, we knew it came from James Thompson. There was always this discussion whether that was actually Glenmore or what it was. It wasn't Glenmore. It was the Yellowstone Distillery in Louisville, which is kind of interesting.
Interesting.
So that's kind of how that whole thing comes full circle, is that final reserve that they released. I think it was in 16, 17. I can't remember which year it was. That was the stash that he kept once he sold the United Distillers as part of his.
Did you try any of that, Wes?
No, I
I
haven't.
did.
I know
I did. It was bad. It was bad.
yeah. So I know a guy that did. And he said it was literally like taking a wet piece of wood out of your yard and just kind of squeezing the juice out of it.
Yeah,
That's what
yeah,
it tastes like.
yeah.
From what I remember, when he kept the whiskey stock, it was anywhere from 7 to 8, 9, 10 years is kind of what that mellow mash was. I think it was a 7-year age statement, but we all know back then you could probably add 3 years to it during the whiskey glut years. So it was, let's call it 10-year whiskey in the barrel when he sold the United Distillers. The problem was it took him like another 15 years to tank it.
Yeah.
And it just set. And that's
Yeah.
why the yield was
It's
terrible.
over-oaked, yeah,
They had,
yeah.
I don't know how many barrels they had that were just bone dry. But yeah, that's where that whiskey came from. That was old Yellowstone mellow mash, which is pretty interesting.
Wes, don't you like those descriptor phrases like mellow mash? And you look at all the old bottles, all the distilleries
Oh, I
come
love
up
it.
with those things. And you don't see that happening anymore. Though I saw in Royce's new rye that he came out with, it reminded me of the old days because it said sweet thumped. I thought that sounded like an old school, like they would have come up with on an old bottle, Prohibition era, something, tagline like they would have put, like mellow mash. It's the same type of thing. It's a descriptor of the process, but that makes it sound really unique and interesting.
Yeah, I mean, as a fan of Dusty's and the history and so forth, I love resurrection of old labels. I love the labels with more vintage information and looks.
Yeah.
I like I like bringing back and embracing all that history when it's so easy to just ignore it and say we're the new thing, we're a new riff on an old tradition and all. Like
Yeah.
I get that there's room for that, but there's also room for kind of holding on to some of the history. It's a rich history and it shouldn't be lost just because just for the hell of it. So I'm all in on that stuff. I'm all in. I'm a proponent of bringing back the gift boxes, bringing back the canters, the whole 9 yards.
Mm-hmm.
People should jump on that and do it. It'd be crazy. So United Distillers are now the owners as of 91. They ended up selling the Kentucky Tavern brand and the Glenmore Distillery to what's now Sazerac. And then obviously during the bourbon depression of the 90s and 2000s, Kentucky Tavern was relegated to low shelf. At one time, it was a blended whiskey. Once the bourbon boom came back, they moved it back to a straight whiskey, but it's now it's basically a bottom shelfer, 80 proof. It is straight bourbon whiskey. It's not blended anymore, but it's a 80 proof bottom shelfer today. It's sadly like Old Crow. There's other brands. There's Kentucky Gentleman. There's a list of old brands today that have been absolutely just discarded and left to the wayside, reduced down to 80 or 86 proof. Some are now blended whiskeys, old charters in that same boat that have such a rich history. And at one time were one of the best whiskeys you could buy, are still, treated kind of like afterthoughts and clinger on kind of things. And unfortunately, Kentucky Tavern is one of those. And I think in our tasting tonight, I think we're going to be, maybe for the first time ever, we're going to have a unanimous across the board on both categories of what's what and what's everyone's favorite, simply because the brand is just there's a shelf filler and a way to get rid of maybe whiskey that doesn't meet up to par. But that's a sad fact. So it's a low shelfer. It's 80 proof right now, and that's the way it was. Interesting enough, though, evidently, and I'd never heard of it until I went through and did this research. There was actually a bar in Louisville in the 50s and 60s that was super popular. And it was actually named after the Kentucky Tavern brand, which is interesting because the brand was trademarked. So I'm not sure how they got away with that. I don't know if it was one of those deals where no one gave a shit. It was in Louisville. It was in the middle of bourbon country in Kentucky, and just no one cared. But yeah, evidently there was a bar in Louisville. It was named after the Kentucky Tavern. It was popular in the 50s and 60s, and then went away sometime 70s, 80s. I think it was. Just an
Interesting.
interesting piece of information I found on research.
There was a real Kentucky Tavern, but it wasn't. That's
Yeah,
not what
there-
the brand
there-
was
there
named
were-
after.
That-
Yeah.
that- no, exactly. Yeah, the brand was there way before
vice
the tavern
versa.
was.
Yeah, yeah.
exactly. It was the opposite effect.
Yeah.
So,
Mhm.
yeah, that's it. It's those Owensboro distilleries, and I'm going to obtain a medley Dusty, and we're going to go through the medley history at one point in time, which that distillery is still operational as Green River. So that's going to be pretty cool to see what they're doing today versus what they were doing back then. But Owensboro is kind of one of those were big players in the game. And I think with Green River and their capacity and the size of that distillery, they're going to be big players pretty soon in the bourbon world, simply because they have the capacity, the warehouses, the stills. And I think they got their
A bottle of that.
Yeah, it's
Beautiful
good stuff.
bottle with
It's a
it's
great
just
bottle.
it's new here to Missouri. So but yeah. And I haven't even opened it yet. I'm gonna open it on a show Friday night and try
Yeah,
it.
and for $35.99, like
Yeah,
it's
cheap.
a great value for what it is. And that's just a start. They're coming out with the bottle and bond. They've got a wheated bourbon they're coming out with. I mean, the whole 9 yards. Steve interviewed Jacob Call on the Bourbon Show not long ago. If you haven't heard that, go back and listen to it. So they're going to do good things. But Owensboro's kind of like a lost area of Kentucky bourbon history. Obviously, Bardstown, Lexington, and Louisville get all the pub, but there's areas like Mason County and Owensboro that were really, really big players at one time that to some degree have been relegated to much less than that.
Yep.
All right. Does anybody need to go back and other than just sipping it for your enjoyment? I don't know. Does anyone need to go back and test 1 versus 2, or I think are we ready to do some voting?
As always, we're going to be voting on 2 things. Guess the Dusty. Which one do you think is the Dusty? And then, so there's some thought process there. The second one, you can't get wrong. It's which is your favorite? Which is your favorite of the night? So you can get one wrong. You can't get the other one wrong. So worst case, you're 50-50 on the night. Our longest streak is Mike Gaskamp. Mike, it's up to your part of your roles as the leaders to keep track of how many in a row you've got. What's the number?
So there was some confusion on this last time, so I went back and actually counted. This will be
Okay.
7 if I get it.
It's 100, right?
Oh, this is the 7th if
7.
you get it. Yeah. We
The
would
7th
not
I get.
we would not allow you to break the record without going back and verifying. But yeah, in the meantime, we're just gonna let you keep track. So
Yeah.
Rick the Legend, what was your record? I can't remember. Was it 16?
something like that, was it? 16 or 18?
You're on mute, Rick, if you I think the palm tree's on it in his ear.
He's got the let's try the unmute. Oh, you're muted, sir. Oh, there he goes. I think now he's
Rick, do you remember what your record was?
I think 17.
17. All right,
17.
so that's
Okay.
it.
So you're even if you get tonight right, Mike, you're still gonna be 10 to go. So
I'll never catch it.
Then I
okay.
missed 2 and I have everything else right.
Okay.
All right, we ready to start voting?
We're ready to start voting.
All right.
Wes, as always, you control this. Who
You got
votes?
it. I'm going to go with Eric Johnson, the Iowa one.
The Iowa one. Okay.
You know, it's a lot of pressure when you set the table that we might be unanimous here, Wes. but-
Right.
Yeah, don't fuck it up.
I'm fairly confident that I'm going to vote for 2 and 2.
2 and 2. Okay.
2 and 2 it is. 2 your favorite and 2's the Dusty.
Yes,
All right.
sir.
All right, let's go Mr. Whitlatch.
2 and 2.
2 and 2.
it is.
All right.
Let's go through the Mace family. Start with Nate.
Okay, well, 2's the Dusty, obviously. I think if 1 were like 100 proof, then maybe I might like it a little bit. The flavor on it's pretty good. It just tastes kind of like water a little bit.
Yeah.
Oh
Yeah.
yeah. Oh yeah.
And so 2 has the advantage in pretty much every other category. So I guess I'll go 2.
2 and 2. Okay. Ultimately, that's what he went. All right.
All right, let's go Robert.
I'm very much a follower. I will say 2 and 2.
Okay.
I like it. Let's
2.
go with Papa Mace.
So I think of the 2, I like 2 the best. I'm going to go with 1 as being the Dusty.
1 is the Dusty. Okay. It's not going to be unanimous.
It's not going to be unanimous.
Yeah,
That's
that we
right.
know. It's not going to be unanimous at this point.
Let's go Mike Blosser.
I'm going to go 2 and 2 as well.
2 and 2. Okay.
Double deuce. Let's go to Tim Swyatt.
I'm going to go 2 and 2 as well.
All right.
2 and 2. Okay.
Let's go Mr. Bill.
2 and 2.
2 and 2.
2 and 2.
Let's go with the legend.
2 and 2.
2 and
Another Double
2.
deuce.
Okay.
Whiskey Joe.
2 and 2, although as far as liking them, they were about even. I mean,
Yeah.
neither one of them is my favorite, but I didn't hate either one of them either.
All right.
Okay.
Let's go with the reigning champ, Mike Gascamp.
I gotta go Roadhouse on this one, man. It's the double deuce.
Double deuce.
Double deuce. Okay.
All right, Steve.
I'm going to follow suit with most. I'm going to go 2 and 2. So our favorite of the night, we got everybody right.
Yeah, we got it right.
Yeah, we got it right. Favorite of the night was clearly number 2, 112 zip over number 1. On the Dusty, if you're keeping track, it's 11 to 1. So Kent Mace is on an island, and if he does this, he's the only one with a streak of 1. That's where it's going to be. So
Remember the movie Dumb and Dumber?
yeah.
And they have that scene where they're like, so you're saying there's a chance.
Yep.
That's Ken right now. He's
He's
hoping
got
out
a- he's got a
he's
chance,
waiting
yeah.
for that one last
Right.
little chance.
Then he is, there's no doubt he's the leader. So, and
Yeah.
again, if you miss an event, you start, it's like Wordle. So if you miss a day of Wordle, your streak starts all over. It's same thing with this. So, so Kent would have the highest streak. So of 1. So.
All right. Well, I love Kent, but in this case, he's in the minority. It is 2
Yeah.
years to Dusty.
It's 2.
I think
It is 2.
this is one where even before I poured, because I was
Yeah,
like,
you
Joe,
could
I was
eyeball
like,
this one. You
yeah,
could
I was
eyeball
like,
this one, right?
like Joe. I've never had Kentucky Tavern, and then I went and grabbed the bottle off. It was literally on the bottom shelf, and then I looked at it, and I was like, well, I already know what the whiskey looks like in the Dusty, and just putting them in the glass was going to be obvious to everyone. But again, I think part of the fun is the guessing, but also part of the fun is going through the history and kind of the learning and education part of it. So this was going to be an easy one. We've had some that are neck and neck and only had a couple of votes different. This one I knew going in, the history was going to have to
and it's still fun to compare and contrast,
It is.
a historic
and nothing
brand versus
else.
what they're putting out there today.
Yeah, and nothing else. We had whiskey from 1968 out of the Glenmore Distillery. So that's pretty damn cool to me.
That's pretty cool. All right, just to catch everybody up, Wes does have some events coming up. The Ancient Age one from 1972 is the next one. That'll be June 13th. So it's going to close out on Monday. Monday's the last day of sales. I'll put a link to this in the email that goes out. But if you're interested in that, there's only, I think, 5 tickets left. So that one's getting low. So the Ancient Age. Then he's got his 1960s Crown Royal in July 18th. And then in August, he's got 2. He's got an Old Charter from 78, the non-chill filtered one on 8/2. And then on 8/9, a week later, he's got the 1970s IW Harper. So
Yeah, I have the other one that I have that we haven't posted yet. That'll probably end up being, I've got 2 in August. It'll probably be September.
yeah.
Is I have acquired, and I'll have to double check the year, but I'm pretty sure it's either a 60s or a 50s. But it's an old Bardstown, not rectified KBD from someone else, but from the original Willett Distillery.
Really?
Yeah, and so proof wise and brand wise, we're going to be able to compare that one directly with the current Willett distilled off the shelf. So I think that one's going to be pretty cool.
That'll be
Get
fun.
into
Yeah.
Get into the Willett Distillery. If Drew and those guys weren't so weird about media, we'd try to get one of those guys on, but they
Yeah,
pretty
they
much
never
don't-
do
They
it.
pretty much don't do it. So we'll have
Yeah.
to do it ourselves, which is fine.
Yeah. So yes, send me that information, Wes, and we'll get that one posted whenever. But we've got the other ones out there. I'll include links to all of those in the email. And on that note, that's it. Wes, anything else, Wes, as we wrap up?
No, I don't have anything else. Anybody have any questions, comments? We'll hang out for a little bit to chat.
Sure.
Thanks, Wes. Appreciate it.
Let's hear it from Mr. Wes
Nice job,
Hardin.
Wes.
Great job.
Thanks, guys.
Great job. All right. We'll say goodbye now. We're, of course, saying goodbye to the at-home audience, the people watching this, the folks that signed up for this and couldn't make it, or that are just watching us on YouTube because they like watching whiskey tastings. So we'll say goodbye to those folks. I'll stick around. Wes will stick around. We'll answer any questions and talk to you about whiskey. All right. See you guys. Bye.
See ya.